Welcome back to Xruug, the Dragon Breeder from Bobo Rhino Miniatures. In this part, we are going to begin working on the dragon armor. Here I've just taken some Cartacci red from Chimera models. I really like this tone because it has super great coverage. I've mixed it with a bit of the violet from Chimera to darken it a little and add some of that purple shadow ambience that I want. Using a pretty large brush, I think this is like a size 6 maybe from Artist Opus. I'm just applying a nice base layer to all of the dragon elements. You can see while the paint is wet, it tends to appear a little brighter. It definitely darkens up a little as it dries. So yeah, I'm just getting really good coverage basically in one layer using pretty much paint right out of the bottle. As long as you apply a nice heavy layer here, you can get coverage based in essentially one coat. The idea is to just apply the paint and then don't let it, don't rub at it too much. If you rub at the paint while it's drying, that's what's going to cause you lift some of the pigment and move it around as it's drying. And that will lift up the drying paint and cause an uneven surface. If you just apply a nice thick layer, let it set, and it will self-level. You won't have any loss of detail using a nice thick layer, and you can get great coverage in one coat. For the shadow side of the figure, I do mix just a little bit of that blue into the layer to get some of that lighter blue tone. It's going to desaturate the red a little bit, shift it slightly more violet. So, yep, the idea is to just cover everything. Okay, now I'm mixing some of that red with the just a touch of the sunny skin tone. That's going to give me a bit more light. At this stage, I'm just sketching out where that main light is going to come from to match with the lighting that's on his skin. So you can see that strong shaft of light that comes in from the top left will affect this arm of the dragon that goes over his shoulder. It'll affect a little bit of these pieces right here. And then on the back of the dragon, over top of it, the hood, and some of the elements on his left side. Here I'm testing with where a small amount of light might hit this, and then here on the belt, this small piece of light that comes down onto his stomach to match up to that little triangle of light that's on his torso. So this mixture of the red that has really great coverage and that little bit of sunny skin tone, maybe sometimes mixing a little yellow into it to warm it up, allows me to get a really bright secondary layer of light on top of that dark red so that I can then begin to integrate the two. Here I'm grabbing just a little bit of orange to mix into the red so I can begin to push that light even brighter without using the sunny skin tone. Because the sunny skin tone has a lot of white in it, it's going to make the red turn pink or salmony really quickly. So I'm using that orange to keep the really strong saturation. I really want a super vibrant reddish tone, and that means when going into that yellowish light that I have from the left, it's going to require me to have a little bit of orange in the mixture. I'll just place some on his vambrace, and then all of these areas on his what would be his right side are left when looking at him from the front. I'm not trying to be super clean at this stage. I just want to get a nice layer on top that I can then begin to build up more and more layers and refine. Now you can see that the mixture has gotten quite orange. I'm just pushing more and more light onto this top left area. I can always pull this back very easily by glazing red back over top of it. But I want a bit of that, like the light is so bright in this area that it kind of blows out the color a little bit. So here I'm just checking to make sure that my light placement is right. And then on the other side, you can see when I mix a little bit of that red and that blue together, maybe a little bit of the skin tone pink, begins to really desaturates that red. This is going to give me that secondary fill light from the right, just like I did on the skin that's a little more bluish. The key thing to remember here is that I don't want to go pure blue with the red, with the cold side, right? The skin is very neutral in tone. It's even though it's slightly yellowish in color, it basically has no real and pure color to the skin tone. It's very tertiary, so it's very gray. So that blue light is going to affect the skin a lot more than it is something that has got a really strong color like red. So the red is going to change. It's going to shift towards blue, but it won't turn pure blue. I still want it to read as red in that shadow side. So here I'm grabbing a little brown mixture, creating a warm brown for these bone areas. I'm just going to base coat all these areas real fast. He has this large skull belt buckle. There's a lot more little small bone elements. I grab a little bit of black, and I'm going to go ahead and just blacken some of these areas that are in really deep shadow to just get a essentially starting point for some of these areas. There's a lot of this blue that I used the airbrush to place the initial color down on the skin that got on the belt. So I need this black to kind of reset. And I use a little bit of the violet mixed in. It's going to give me some amount of that violet color that's in the shadows and these black in this black base coat. So basically anything that is not his skin at this stage, I want to just get blacked out so that I can then rebuild up the light from there. This is also going to give me some really strong shadows that, like this dark lining that helps separate the elements from each other, such as the small belts around his arm. That really dark, as I paint on top of these elements, right? That leaving a little bit of that black in the deepest recesses will create a really strong line of definition between the elements and help to separate them really well. So I continue on, just painting in more black. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but this is an important stage of the painting. Getting good coverage at this stage will save you a lot of headaches later trying to go back in. And if I painted over top of the gauntlet, for example, and then tried to go around and individually line everything with like a really thin brush with just a black line, it would could create a mess. So now I'm back to the dragon scales, and I'm going to start using some intermediate tones and doing some stippling of intermediate tones to begin to pick out the little individual scales and soften some of these transitions. So using the mixtures I have on my palette, I can find any intermediate mixture I need to just quickly say, okay, so these scales I need to add a little bit more lightness to, or I need a little more of an intermediate tone here. I can just place the small dots on top to begin to pick out these individual scales and blend some of these transitions, though it's not really blending. I'm not trying to create a smooth surface. I just want to soften these transitions. Now, you could, you might think, like, hey, why don't you just paint it like normal and then use a wash to, shade in between all of the individual scales. And while that's possible, what that would do is create the exact same shadow in between all of the scales. And in these areas of light, I don't want the same shadow that I want on, say, the shadow side, perhaps, right? The shadows in this area of light, because they face directly at the light, will be brighter than they would on the shadow side. The shadow side then might go almost all the way to black, where when in this area of direct sunlight, the shadows in between the scales could actually be more like a neutral, like a middle red. And then I highlight up from there. This will give me a much stronger dynamic range of lighting, even within my shadows. So here I'm just creating some of the small midtones in between on the like knuckles of his hand, and some of these areas that are, even though they're rounding over towards the bottom side, they still face the light, so I need to put some intermediate light there. And I want to think about not just individual scales, but also the overall volume of the arm, right? So areas like on his knuckles or at the wrist of the dragon might get more light than on where the fingers start to curl underneath. But here you can see I'm really starting to just like try and paint these individual scales. But I'm focusing the light more in these areas that are going to catch the light more. And I want to create this kind of specular highlight to the scales to make them feel a bit shiny or iridescent, right? If you think about some lizards, they might or snakes, right? A snake has sometimes like a very glossy feeling to its scales. This the same kind of effect I'm trying to go for here, where I put a little bit of shine in certain areas, almost like a non-metallic effect to create a really bright shine to the scaled surface. And as long as I maintain that red in the midtone, I can really push this to very bright, like yellowish orange, and it'll still feel red. It's just important that I don't overdo this. If I overdo it and I use too much of this light orange, I'll kill that red, and then I won't have the, that red feeling anymore. Red can definitely be a tricky color to highlight. It's very easy to overdo it, use too much white in the mixture, and make it go pink. So typically, I would say should be a bit more conservative with your use of highlights on red, and try and maintain more of that pure red color. Notice here that most of the light is following the cylindrical shape of the arm. So even though I'm highlighting individual scales, if you were to take the texture out of it, it would follow that that parallel line, that cylindrical shape of the arm. So I'm not highlighting all the scales the same. I do want that center line of light. So this middle row of scales that runs vertically gets more light than the ones on the side do. In some of these smaller scales on the edge, I just place a little bit of mid-tone as a highlight, right? So the mid-tone in areas of shadow can function as a highlight on the edge of some of these scales just to give them some definition. Right here where the wrist starts to curve over, that would be the point at which that specular highlight would show up most and creates that really strong shiny highlight to the dragon scales. And because it's also got that cylindrical shape, when I'm highlighting I'm always highlighting the scales on the edge that faces in towards the center, right? So if you imagine the arm as a cylinder, I always want to highlight the top of the scales that face in towards the middle of the cylinder. Essentially the light catching on the edge that faces closest to the viewer. And this takes a while. It's not the fastest process. Here I'm grabbing a bit of the red. I believe this is alizarin crimson from Chimera Models, and I'm just applying a glaze over the top to restore some of that red color back to it, and also thin down. It'll help run into the recesses like a wash. You can think of it almost somewhere between a glaze and a controlled wash. So it jumped forward a little bit, but in the meantime, I went in and I took some of this whole red and violet, and I did a thin glaze in the airbrush. Sorry, this part was not recorded, but I did a thin glaze over top of the shadows of the skin to just add some additional depth to the shadows. So it's not quite as blue. I wanted to shift the shadows a little more red so that this secondary blue light that I'm painting now, that I'm restoring after doing the glaze effectively with the airbrush, I can restore that cool desaturated blue light over top of this top right light without everything feeling completely washed out in that blue. It was a little, I felt it was a little too much of a blue at that stage. So now this blue is a little bit more gray than it was before. And I'm just adding some new lights to redefine some of these volumes and shape from the right side. But that red in the shadows really helps tie in the red of the dragon to the rest of the figure and give a little warmth to the ambience that I wasn't quite getting with just the purple and blue. So I make some small adjustments here, just trying to redefine these shapes. Using a mixture of that whole red and this grayish blue tone that I have. Now, I never want this light to be as bright or even close to as bright as the main light source. This is just to give some shape to the shadow side of the figure. If you want to do this effect with an airbrush, you could easily do this, and I did it some on the face. You could easily do it with a brush using glazes, filtering with a slightly transparent paint to create the same effect. It's very easy to do with the airbrush, though, by just applying thin layers from below. If you're not confident, if you're not super confident doing it, I suggest thinning it way down and really slowly, like, make really small adjustments, 10, 20 layers through the airbrush. That's very thin, until it reaches the point where you want. It's much better to try and do it in small adjustments than to overdo the airbrush and have to try and then go back and fix what you've done, right? If you do it in thin layers, the airbrush is super fast and you can create, really, really subtle changes. So here on the head, I'm just restoring some of the fill light and softening the transition back to the shadow. Pushing a little bit more of that yellow tone into the beard. I really want that warm yellow light to complement this like bit more warmer purple shadow that we have. Here on the bottom side of the beard, I'm using a dark purple color to just create some texture within the shadow. I don't want it as textured as the light, because effectively what texture is the contrast that you get from light and shadow, right? If you don't have light, you don't see any texture because there's no shadows to create the texture. So in areas of shadow, I can create some very subtle texture, but I don't want it to be as strong as the areas of the main light source. So here again, I'm coming back to the blue-gray and just defining some of the musculature. I think when you're doing this kind of very strong lighting where you have a very shadowed side of the figure, you need this kind of subtle fill light from the side, whether it's from the back or just the opposite side of the light, to give some definition to the figure. If I painted this all just dark, left it all the same dark purple, the figure would feel very flat. So here I'm adding some black to the extreme shadows. These are what I call occlusion shadows. So this is areas that are like up in the armpit where you're going to get your pure blacks, right? This is where no bounce lights can get to. So here I'm just trying to define some of the oblique muscles on the side and create a bit more shape. And while it looks pretty contrasted when you're looking at it like this, right? That blue looks quite bright next to the pure blacks when you see the figure in totality, and you see the light. Here I am checking with the head to make sure everything's working, right? When you see everything together, you can see that blue is nowhere near as bright as the very warm yellow light of the shoulder. All right, so now I'm going to start to paint the bone. I have a nice reddish brown here. Bone is another very interesting color, like skin, where it's very tan, very gray. It doesn't have a real strong color of its own. So there's a lot of different colors you can use in bone, and depending on the ambience of the scene, can change the color of the bone a lot. So because I have this very strong, warm light, I'm using more browns and reds in the bone. But if you had a very cold scene, you might have more greenish tones. It's the color of the environment will affect things that are naturally more grayish a lot more than it'll affect other colors. So here on this shadow side, which this is all going to get painted over because the OSL of the egg later, but you can see I'm making this very purplish gray tone for the cold side of the belt. And it will all get undone. But, part of the painting process for me is sometimes testing and building as if the light wasn't there. And then you add these elements later, right? The paint job evolves as you go. So here I'm adding some more light. I'm still thinking about that center shaft of light that's coming down. So that will continue on to the belt here. And this is a bit of a cold gray at the moment for the belt, but this will get warmed up also as I continue to work on it. I will at some point realize that this is not orange enough, and I will make adjustments. But I'm just painting, building up layers, building up the light, trying to create these volumetric shapes. I paint a bit of the red in between the bone as if there is a like a reddish leather. Maybe it's some kind of dragon skin that doesn't have really strong scales on it. But just to continue with the the red and create something distinct from the bone color. So I grab some dark sand, which is a nice warm tan, and continue to mix that into my brown. Now I can really start to paint in the shape of this light that continues down his stomach. At this point, though, the light is coming in pretty direct from above as it continues, like his body continues to curve, and most of the light is going to be focused kind of on like the top edges of the bone, as opposed to the front shape of these elements. Right, so kind of testing that, just sort of drawing that line where that'll be. Thinking about the angle. So here now I'm realizing that this needs way more orange in it. So I mix a bunch of orange into that brown and dark sand, using the same orange I used before, right? This is just the ambient color of the scene. So I can utilize the same colors I already had on my palette. I don't need to search my palette for an orange brown, right? I can just take the color I already have, realize that it needs a bit more warm orange colors from the light, and I can just add that to the mixture to warm up that color a little bit. Here on some of the parts where the light does not reach, I add a bit more of that blue-gray to the bone. This is going to really start to desaturate it, and it's almost hard to tell whether, like, what's on the brush right now. Is it blue? Is it brown? Right? Gray can be a super powerful color, right? Just in context of the rest of the colors that are around it. Shift that gray just slightly more cold can almost make it feel blue, even if it's actually, if you were to look at it in isolation, it would still be a brown tone. Right. What's on the brush is a brown. If I painted it, on the blue itself, it would look brown, but because it's next to all these warm reds, it looks much cooler than it is. So now I'm really starting to put in the light of this main light source. Adding these warm orange tones to the tops of these little skulls. And this will get pushed even further, but because I need to maintain that strong contrast between what is the shadow side and what is the light. And pointing out the line of this shape. So here's where the light comes in. It hits the center part of the belt. Then continuing that line onto the bone where any of this very strong light will hit. So all of the bottom part, it's interesting because I have this skull shape is kind of two shapes, right? It's kind of two flats. There's a center ridge. So one half of the skull is going to be completely in shadow, but getting hit by the cold side, which will eventually be the OSL side from the egg. And then the other side is still in shadow, but then there's a thin band of light that comes and draws a line right across it. So I have almost 3 sections of the skull that I need to be thinking about. The bounce light side, the area that's facing towards the light but's in shadow because it's being blocked by his chest, and then the thin shaft of light that comes through. Here I'm adding a little cast shadow from the brow of the skull, and then the small skulls cast a shadow on this area inside the belt, right? The backing. Then I'm going to have a little bit of this light hit onto those kind of tusks. Adding a bit more warmth to the intermediate areas. And trying to further delineate where the cast shadow is and where the main light is. For me, this is always this can be one of the toughest things to paint when you're doing a strong directional light like this, because there are very specific parts of the skull that are going to get hit by direct sunlight, and then there's kind of these areas that are almost in the light, but they're just curving away. So you get into these kind of halftone lights that are not in direct sunlight, but they're not quite in shadow either. They're in that middle area. And often the decision making when doing something like this can come down to not necessarily what's physically accurate in terms of, like, what the exact physics of the light would be where it hits, and what is aesthetically pleasing, right? So I have some room here to make decisions, to maybe highlight some areas that I feel like I want to stand out more to emphasize this effect, even if it's not perfectly realistic in terms of the direction that the lighting is. So I'm using a bit of this purple and black glaze just to add some lining around things, just darken some of these shadow areas of the backing of the belt more. You can see that because the bone is just a naturally brighter color, right? It just has a naturally brighter value of a material than the red leather does. the shadows are also going to be lighter, right? So you can see sometimes I'll tilt the model upwards to kind of look and see where these lights are hitting here. I'm making an adjustment to this small section of the waistband just to make sure it lines up with the light column. Here, maybe this light wouldn't be that bright on that section of the stomach, but it looks good, right? It helps further emphasize this directional light. So I painted a little brighter maybe than it should be, just because I like the way it looks aesthetically.